Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. This is part 2 of my conversation with Mr. Jared Labell about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Labell is Executive Director of Taxpayers United of America. He's the author of the article Mr. Truman, or How I Learned to Start Worrying and Hate the Bomb. You can follow his work at taxpayersunited.org. You can find him on Facebook under Taxpayers United of America, on his personal Twitter account at DC_DeathCult, and on Twitter at Taxpayers United. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/atomic-bombs-2. So even after the horrific Hiroshima bombing, of course, there was still the horrific Nagasaki bombing. What sorts of justifications are used towards that Nagasaki bomb, given that the Hiroshima bomb had already occurred?
Well, it's really interesting because while many libertarians, and I hope all libertarians, would oppose the dropping of the atomic bombs, but some will hesitate to say that it shouldn't have happened at all. Okay, fine. And that happens amongst other people of other ideologies. Obviously, I'm speaking to a particular audience, but what's really interesting is that throughout the historical research and consensus, even if there's justification in some minds for the Hiroshima bombing, the Nagasaki bombing becomes much harder of a case to make. Robert Higgs, again, wrote a terrific article talking about this and making the case that this was just an absolute war crime. At that point, after the Hiroshima bombing, Japan was even more prepared to surrender to the United States further than further than what they had agreed to previously and were attempting to work out through diplomatic channels. And the argument can be made that maybe they should have at least been allowed more time. It wasn't as if they were able to really deploy their fleet of any sort or their air fleet as well to try to attack the United States or to try to really continue the war much further. They were basically defeated at that point. And the bombing of Nagasaki was just a further show of strength, even more so than to Japan, to the Soviet Union. And so you could say that the Cold War is really born in the fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the decades and decades of communism and horrific crimes that occur throughout the world due to the rivalry of the one-time friendly, now not so much, Soviet Union versus the United States.
Right, and on the subject of libertarian opposition to the atomic bombs and their use, and of course, it seems to me that it would be really impossible to justify the dropping of the atomic bombs from any coherently held ideological viewpoint, whether it be a liberal, conservative, socialist, you name it, it would seem impossible to justify the use of the atomic bombs from pretty much any ideological viewpoint. But on the subject of libertarian opposition, and we discussed this with Mary Ruart a few months ago, but at the Libertarian Party's National Convention, they held a debate the evening before they voted on who the nominee would be, and 4 of the 5 candidates at the debate either said that the use of the bombs was justified, or they weren't opposed to it, or they didn't think Obama, who had recently been in Hiroshima at that time, needed to apologize, and they said they would not have apologized as president. And one of those 4 people who made comments like that was Gary Johnson, who, of course, is the Libertarian Party presidential nominee. As far as I'm concerned, the atomic bombs, and I hesitate to use this term, but their use can largely be a litmus test for whether one is a libertarian or not. It seems like that right there would automatically be a disqualifier if someone feels like the use of the atomic bombs were justified. But I want to turn our attention a little more to some dissent against the bombs and further reasons why the bombs were unnecessary. So we've obviously outlined the civilian carnage and the destruction and the significance of the atrocities that went with the use of the atomic bombs, and we discussed the situation in World War II at that time and the status of the Japanese and the military fight at that point. But what are some other reasons why the atomic bombs were unnecessary? How much did they cost? What did some of the prominent political and military figures say at the time? Can you walk through any reasons that we haven't touched on already?
Sure. So that's another issue that I don't think people know very well, that there were a number of American military leaders that were absolutely opposed to the dropping of the nuclear weapons. Admiral Leahy, the president's chief of staff at the time, he's the top official presiding over the meetings of the Joint Chief, as well as combined forces abroad. He said that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. So this is, again, President's chief of staff, Admiral William Leahy, said unequivocally this was absolutely unnecessary. Admiral Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, said the Japanese had in fact already sued for peace before the atomic age was announced to the world with the destruction of Hiroshima and before the Russian entry into the war. So he did not think it was necessary to use these weapons against these civilian populations. But I think it's very important to what you said about litmus tests to see where people stand. And I don't think I had really realized that it was that bad in the Libertarian Party. That is astonishing and really awful. So maybe we don't need the Libertarian Party. I think Rothbard makes a really good point in War, Peace, and the State, his famous monograph, where he talks about the use of nuclear weapons and how they can't really be used defensively. At least libertarians can make the case of rifles, bow and arrows, weapons that really can be targeted in defensive purposes, because that's what we would argue. We're peaceful people who have the right to self-defense. Nuclear weapons are not really defensive weapons in any way, and they cannot be targeted in such a way to only affect one or two or small groups of individuals. These have long-lasting effects that are devastating in both the amount of death and destruction that they can cost on individuals and in areas. Nuclear weapons in 2016, they cost taxpayers a lot of money. We're paying about $2.19 million every hour for nuclear weapons, their maintenance, proliferation. There's a big push right now that's supposed to cost a couple other $1 billion to take our current nuclear stockpiles and restructure them in ways that will somewhat reduce them, but the strength is still going to be there. So it's using newer technology to have a bigger bang for the buck, which, in my view, is still horrific. We need to scale these down immediately. There have been numerous times where atomic bombs have accidentally gone off. Another issue I don't think many people are aware about, there was a hydrogen bomb that crashed near Abilene, Texas in 1958. We're just lucky that conventional detonation didn't happen and trigger. Abilene could have been wiped off the face of the earth. And when a couple of these incidents have occurred, we found out through different reporting and memoirs and things that there were pretty much already plans in place to blame the Soviet Union. So if one of these bombs had accidentally triggered over North Carolina, immediately the Soviets did it. We're not exactly sure. There was different outlines, I believe, as to how they would blame the Soviets, whether they had accidentally triggered a U.S. bomb or the Soviets had actually delivered one to the mainland. But regardless, it's really, I think, revealing of the mentality of some of the people who are in charge of these weapons. And again, it's cost taxpayers since their inception trillions and trillions of dollars. And it's really reminiscent of Orwell with his giant floating fortresses in 1984, where money is just dumped into these military weapons and then never really used and then just sunk into the ocean. And it's a way of taking money from the taxpayers, funneling it into the merchants of death, that create these things. And look, I don't want them to be used. I think that we should keep our money and they should stop building these weapons. So at least I guess half of that is good, that they're not being used and haven't been in warfare since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But unfortunately, the U.S. has that on its record. It is the only state that has used nuclear weapons in warfare, and that's a very, very sad statement.
Right, and on the subject of prominent individuals who opposed the use of the atomic bombs and dissented from the narrative that they should have been used, you obviously mentioned Admiral Leahy and Admiral Nimitz, but there was also Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Herbert Hoover, even Curtis LeMay. And LeMay was not opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, in other conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. Luckily, atomic bombs and nuclear weapons were not used in those conflicts. But it just goes to show how unnecessary they were in the conflict with Japan in World War II when you have figures like that opposing and speaking out against their use.
And then, yeah, exactly. And then on the other side of that, the civilians who were speaking out against these weapons. And I think it's great for libertarians to know that there is this history that maybe they're unaware of. But renowned author Zora Neale Hurston, the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God, an African-American woman who's part of the Harlem Renaissance, she stood out from many of her peers who were far to the left, some of them overtly in line with the communists and things. But she stood up against this, and she thought of Truman as a monster. She said in a letter to, it was Claude Barnett of the Associated Negro Press, she wrote that Truman is a monster. I can think of him as nothing else but the butcher of Asia. Of his grin of triumph on giving the order to drop the atom bombs on Japan, is it that we were so devoted to a good massa that we feel that we ought not to even protest such crimes? And as well as Isabel Patterson, another prominent libertarian from that period of time, the writer of The God of the Machine, she was absolutely horrified by the idea of these weapons being used. And she said that Truman's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and employing science to carry out these crimes was a way to fry Japanese babies in atomic radiation. And so she looked at it as the cycle of life and death being cut off by taxpayer dollars and by the government itself. And then it goes on from there. There's a tremendous book written by Bill Kaufman, who publishes many times through the American Conservative magazine. He wrote a book called Ain't My America, and it's about anti-war conservatives, libertarians, and kind of Midwestern anti-imperialism throughout American history. And you'll find many who libertarians will be familiar with outlined in this book. That definitely were on the side of peace and against these government programs, which wind up costing taxpayers trillions of dollars and lives lost and insecurity. Because at the end of the day, I think that's really the important thing. It's good to be able to talk in abstracts and theory, and I enjoy doing that as much as anyone. But I think talking about how this affects real people all the time is important. And so the fact is, at any time, one of these nuclear weapons today could accidentally be triggered, and that will change history for the worse immediately. And I don't see anything being as important as trying to get these weapons of destruction out of the hands of the state. Both the United States, because that's our responsibility as Americans, while we would like to try to see nuclear disarmament throughout the world, and that's a laudable goal, our main concern needs to be our government, who takes money from us and tries to speak and act in our name. And so I think libertarians need to once again take this up as an issue and partner with the left, partner with people that would not expect us to care about this sort of thing, because it really is a grave threat, especially at a time, again, where Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton is going to take over the imperial throne, and both of them are more than happy to start trouble with nuclear-armed nations. And so we need to talk about this. It's a very important issue that has been ignored for much too long.
It definitely is. And two more things I want to very, very quickly get to. The first one is the monetary costs of the Manhattan Project of the atomic bombs, and whether there are any figures you can cite to show just how enormous those costs were. And the second one is the subject of Harry Truman. When Harry Truman left office, he had extremely low approval ratings. I believe they were the lowest approval ratings of any president since there have been approval ratings for presidents, and since that sort of polling has been done. But now Truman is looked at as a great president, and he's celebrated, when in reality he was a war criminal. And I feel like that is the appropriate way to look at him, especially since people of all different stripes, all different ideologies view his decision to go ahead and use the atomic bombs as the most significant events of his presidency.
Yeah, so regarding the costs, the number has been pinpointed in a couple different surveys, somewhere between $5 to $7 trillion over the life cycle of the nuclear weapons programs in America as we know them. And some of those numbers are difficult to parse out because of secrecy and FOIA requests that are not readily answered by the DOD as well as the Department of Energy and other government agencies who are attached to the correct production and maintenance of nuclear weapons. But on top of that, as I mentioned before, the National Priorities Project calculates about $2.19 million are spent every hour for the nuclear weapons and their maintenance. And then we're looking at also some other costs where they're actually trying to use the horrible F-35 program, the F-35 Lightning Strike Fighter, to deliver some of these nuclear weapons. And so some of the updates to the equipment are going to cost an additional $500 billion. And that was, I believe, in the last few months, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy had testified about some of these costs. So it's an enormous amount of money, going way back, decades and decades, where obviously none of us were alive to approve of these programs, and the fact that they have a life of their own and can continue on and continue costing money. And again, a lot of insecurity, I think. I think there's a lot of discussion that should be had over what kind of deterrents are really had by maintaining these weapon systems, and the threat of other countries gaining such weapons, not really because they want to use them, but again, as a way of trying to deter U.S. power and conventional weaponry. And so it's really hard to predict the unintended consequences of this type of foreign policy decisions.
It definitely is. So one final question, and we've touched on, and it's going to be a two-parter, and we've touched on both of these things over the course of the interview, but I want to address it very quickly again before we wrap up, and that's the fallout from this as pertains to the ending of World War II, the Japanese keeping their emperor on the throne. Mao taking over in China is something that isn't often associated with the U.S. demands for unconditional surrender, but in some ways it very well could be, and of course he was a horrific monster responsible for maybe 30 million deaths in China. This leading to the Cold War and the increasing of tensions with the Soviet Union. So sort of the legacy and the fallout from the atomic bombs. And then the other thing very quickly I want to address again is what we can learn from the use of the atomic bombs and apply to today about nuclear weapons in general.
Sure. So, the nuclear age was born with the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the consequences, as you outlined, are far-reaching and numerous. And the spread of communism and the fight between the United States and the Soviets that continued on through proxy wars and through horrible economic policies on both sides, those are all consequences of the nuclear age. So I think it's important to be able to talk about this in a broader scope because, again, it keeps always coming back to the point of saving American lives is what others will say. But I think libertarians need to make the point that lives were absolutely lost. People were sacrificed, and that maybe there are other policies that should be pursued that would actually save lives, not in a hypothetical way or by killing others to save additional lives, but rather avoiding such conflict to begin with. So the Cold War was a ridiculous waste of money. It was unnecessary, as unnecessary as the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Most free market people should recognize that communism and socialism don't work. That's our main critique, is that these economic systems are failures. And so to fight them and perpetuate them really only gives them more credence. So that is a very dramatic consequence of the dropping of the nuclear weapons. And then I'm sorry, part two.
Part two was just the legacy of the atomic bombs and what we can learn from that experience and from their use and apply to today. Sure.
And so, we see the conflict now between the United States and Iran, the ongoing will they or won't they, that is the United States invade or drop bombs in a way of trying to stop their nuclear weapons program, which I would very much recommend to all of your listeners to read Gareth Porter and his numerous interviews with Scott Horton and his book, Manufactured Crisis, about the Iran nuclear weapons program, which, in fact, is mostly a program that was a civilian program that perhaps there were vestiges of a nuclear weapons program years ago, but those ceased. And so a lot of the drum up to war with Iran is simply propaganda that is part of another geopolitical fight between neoconservatives and nationalists and liberal war hawks. So we see that as a very dramatic issue that could have far-reaching consequences if the U.S. was to pursue war as a way of trying to stop nuclear proliferation. But again, the two nations that really are the leading proponents of nuclear war would be the United States and Russia. And at a time where Trump is somewhat flirting with Putin and Hillary wants to fight him, I think it's very, very alarming that they are so casual with their words and their, hopefully they don't act upon them, but their threats. When there's a lot of lives at stake, there is history is at stake, and I think again we need to interject that these weapons are absolutely horrifying in their costs in both lives and dollars, and that we need to come out in front of this issue and really demand nuclear abolition as quickly as possible, because I wouldn't put it past the U.S. state currently to blame an accidental nuclear detonation on terrorists or another nation state that the U.S. is fighting as a way of deterring or as a way of trying to push away blame if the U.S. was to, again, accidentally drop a bomb over South Dakota, accidentally detonate something while transferring a weapon across California. I would not put it past the current government to blame that on a foreign actor as a way of trying to get out from the responsibility of having done something horrific which could have been avoided.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. We've obviously mentioned a lot of resources and books and articles already over the course of this interview, but are there any resources that we haven't mentioned so far that you would like to add that you think are worth looking at for those who are interested in learning more about the topics we've discussed in this interview?
Sure, sir. So besides what we've mentioned, I would just reiterate, though, that the work of Robert Higgs and Anthony Gregory at the Independent Institute on many issues, but specifically on these issues as well, I think your listeners would benefit from. And Sheldon Richman has written extensively about this subject over the years. You can find him at Free Association, where he blogs. But this is his work has been reprinted through the Foundation for Economic Education, the Future of Freedom Foundation, the Center for Stateless Society as well. So I think his articles are pretty well spread out through them. But those three gentlemen, I think, have really written very effectively on this subject from a libertarian perspective, which I think also can really reach a broader audience who normally wouldn't be receptive to such things or needs to have a point of view that isn't necessarily sympathetic to conservatives, but can talk to them. And by referencing some of these other luminaries, whether they be in the private sector like Zora Neale Hurston and Isabel Patterson, or discussing as well military leaders who were opposed to the use of the weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think that's a way of bridging a gap with conservatives who normally, I think, would probably side with the state, even if it was, the Democrat Truman who did it. Many of them will reflexively side with the military, and it's important to come at the right from the right and the left from the left and make sure that they understand that they're half right. They need to be libertarians and look at these issues from a really more of an individualist perspective with peace in mind.
Sure. And what are the best ways to follow your work?
Oh, sure. So I'm with Taxpayers United of America. I'm the executive director. My work can be found through them at taxpayersunited.org. We can also be found on Facebook and Twitter. And if you dare to, you can follow my personal Twitter. My handle is @DC_deathcult. And I many times will share controversial opinions, apparently, but to libertarians, I think we really enjoy the back and forth. And the idea, of course, is to spread the word of markets and peace. So I'd also like to say that your listeners should absolutely visit antiwar.com. By far the best source for foreign policy news, run by libertarians since 1995. Yes, libertarians got the URL antiwar.com, but you'll find people printed there everywhere from Pat Buchanan to Ralph Nader to Daniel Ellsberg, all that support that website because of its dedication to the issues of foreign policy and non-interventionism. So I think that's really a one-stop shop for keeping up with current trends and foreign policy news as well.
All right, well, great. And I want to remind everybody to go check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/atomic-bombs. And this might be split into two parts, so if that's the case, then wakeupcallpodcast.com/atomic-bombs-2 will be the show notes page for part 2. And, of course, there will be links to Taxpayers United of America and to antiwar.com and Murray Rothbard's War, Peace, and the State, the Reiko article on Hiroshima and Nagasaki we've been discussing, the Anthony Gregory articles we've been discussing, the Robert Higgs articles we discussed, especially the one on economic warfare. Every resource that we've mentioned over the course of this interview, there will be links available at wakeupcallpodcast.com/atomic-bombs, just the show notes page for this episode. And if there is a part 2, if I do in fact split this into 2 parts, then wakeupcallpodcast.com/atomic-bombs-2 will be the place to go for part 2. And while you're on our website, I want to encourage you to sign up for our email list and to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so that you can stay up to date on what's going on with the show and make sure to catch every single episode. And Jared, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm sorry I went on so long. I'm trying to keep these episodes down a little bit time-wise, but I have a tendency to go way over, and especially on a topic like this where I get so fired up and I interject my opinions and some of the research and facts that I've come across much more so than I would on other topics. So thanks for being patient and bearing with me, and thank you for joining me and being so generous with your time.
Absolutely. I absolutely love the podcast, and it was my pleasure.
All right. Well, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.